Welcome to another economic debate. My name is Enrique Alcaraz. I am an economist graduated from the University of La Sorbonne in Paris, and today we're facing off two AIs that I have previously trained. On one side, the father of economic liberalism, Adam Smith. On the other, the economic model most used in our world, John Maynard Keynes. They are going to be faced over one topic: is interventionism good or bad for the economy? The debate will be divided into four distinct parts. First, the role of the state in the economy. Second, recessions, crises, and unemployment. Third, economic growth. And finally, fourth, inequality and social fairness. Who was right? Who was wrong? Who better understood how the world or the economy should work? At the end of the video, we'll have the final result of the debate, decided objectively by an external AI. It will evaluate all arguments and determine the winner. Once said that and established the rules, let the debate begin. Let the debate begin.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin this debate by appealing to a simple yet powerful principle. The natural freedom of man to pursue his own self-interest is the foundation of the most efficient economic order humanity has ever known. In The Wealth of Nations, I stated that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. When each individual seeks to improve their own condition, guided by what I called the invisible hand, they unintentionally contribute to the general welfare. The market, when left to operate without interference, allocates resources more efficiently than any bureaucrat could ever imagine. The state, undoubtedly, has its role: to uphold justice, defend the nation, and provide certain public works that would not be profitable for individuals. But beyond that, its intervention is often harmful. When a government tries to direct the economy, it introduces distortions, creates artificial privileges, and stifles competition. History is full of examples of well-intentioned interventions that have ended up creating monopolies, shortages, or corruption. Let man be free to trade, produce, and exchange. Order will emerge, not from the design of a planner, but from the spontaneous dynamism of the market.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Allow me with due respect to firmly disagree. The vision of a perfectly self-regulating market, driven by individual interests, is, in my view, a beautiful illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. Economic history, especially that of the 20th century, has irrefutably shown that markets do not always tend toward equilibrium, nor do they guarantee general well-being. In fact, they can fall into vicious cycles of mass unemployment, overproduction, or rampant speculation, without any invisible hand coming to the rescue. The state is not an intruder in the natural order, but a necessary architect of the modern economic system. Was it not the New Deal, in the midst of the Great Depression, that managed to revive the US economy when the market had collapsed? Was it not public action, through investment, regulation, and institutions, that rebuilt Europe after World War II? The pure competition you imagine is an abstraction. In practice, markets tend toward monopoly, abuse of power, and the exclusion of many. Without a visible hand, that of the state, to regulate, balance, and correct, the capitalist system becomes a machine of instability and inequality. The state must be a guide, a stabilizer, and a referee, not to stifle private initiative, but to allow it to flourish under fair, sustainable, and humane conditions.
Mr. Keynes, I appreciate your passionate intervention, although, as expected, I deeply disagree. You claim that the market is a beautiful illusion, and I would argue that it is, in fact, the most realistic of systems. It requires neither utopias nor all-knowing planning, only the freedom to act in one's self-interest within a framework of justice and free competition. You cite the New Deal, and rightly so, but you fail to mention that this intervention, while it may have provided temporary relief, did not solve the structural problems until World War II arrived, which was hardly a model of sustainable economic policy. And if Europe rose again after the war, it was more due to free trade and reconstruction based on private investment than to permanent public spending. You confuse the failures of specific markets with a systemic failure of the market itself. Yes, monopolies can arise. But isn't it often the state's intervention, its privileges, subsidies, or protections that gives rise to those monopolies? The state often acts not as a neutral referee, but as a biased agent, captured by special interests and hampered by inefficient bureaucracies. Excessive regulation, far from empowering citizens, makes them dependent. In contrast, a free economy, as I have defended, allows individuals to elevate their condition through merit, innovation, and effort. Let the merchant trade, the worker negotiate, the entrepreneur invest. Not under the state's constant supervision, but under their own responsibility. That is the true path to prosperity.
An elegant rebuttal. Mr. Smith, though not necessarily a more accurate one, allow me to remind you that your defence of individual liberty overlooks an essential fact. The individual does not always act with perfect information, nor under equal conditions. The market, as it operates in the real world, is not that ideal system of perfect competition you describe, but rather a space where inequalities concentrate. Externalities arise, and economic cycles cause unnecessary suffering. And who, if not the state, has the capacity and the responsibility to correct these failures? You say that it was World War II, not the New Deal, that brought the US out of the crisis. True. It did so through massive, sustained and directed public spending, exactly what I had proposed years earlier, and for which I was criticised. The only difference is that military spending was accepted without hesitation, while social spending was viewed with suspicion. But the economic principle was the same, to activate aggregate demand through state investment. As for Europe, it was not free trade that rebuilt the continent, but plans like the Marshall Plan, that is, massive public aid, strategically channeled, and accompanied by national policies of public investment, social protection, and regulation. You fear the state because you see in it a leviathan that stifles freedom. I see it as a civilizing tool. A market without rules leads to chaos, not order. Would you allow anyone to build bridges without standards? Then why should we let the financial system, which sustains the lives of millions, operate without supervision? Merit and effort flourish in a stable environment. And it is the state, Mr. Smith, that can and must guarantee that stability.
Mr. Keynes, I appreciate the depth of your reasoning, though I continue to see in it an excessive faith in the state's ability to correct that which, in many cases, it simply does not understand. You argue that individuals do not act with perfect information, and that is true. But I return the question to you. Do state bureaucrats possess it? Do they hold some superior knowledge that allows them to plan, allocate resources, set prices, and direct entire sectors without making even greater mistakes? History, not theory, shows us that state attempts to replace the market have produced more distortions than solutions. Was it not centralized planning in the USSR that led to inefficiency, scarcity, and stagnation? And in democracies, do we not constantly see how political interests taint economic decisions, favoring short-term electoral gain over long-term development? You speak of the Marshall Plan as salvation, but you omit a crucial detail. That aid was not a nationalization or control of the economy, but a boost to reconstruction, led afterwards by entrepreneurs, merchants, and industrialists in an environment that progressively liberalized. It was the return to the market, not its denial, that lifted Europe. Finally, you mention bridges. Well, I have never denied the role of the state in essential public works. I wrote clearly, the duty of the sovereign is to erect and maintain certain public works, which it could never be in the interest of any individual to erect or maintain. But to leap from that to the idea that the state must supervise, intervene, and direct every cog in the economic machine, that is a vast overreach. Trust, Mr. Keynes, not in the omniscience of the state, but in the decentralized mechanisms of the market, where millions of free decisions adjust spontaneously, correcting one another, guided by price and self-interest. That is true economic harmony.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for your final intervention in this first round. Allow me to close this section with clarity and evidence. No, bureaucrats are not omniscient, but the argument that because they don't know everything, it's better to do nothing, is deeply irresponsible. I am not proposing to replace the market with the state. That is a caricature. What I advocate is pragmatic correction. not elimination. If we let markets operate without any intervention, who will respond to banking crises, speculative bubbles, financial panics, mass unemployment, or structural poverty? The USSR, which you mention, is not my model. Totalitarianism and full central planning are as far from my proposals as your market anarchism is. I defend mixed economies, where the state and the market complement each other, not cancel one another out. As Paul Samuelson rightly pointed out, modern capitalism cannot sustain itself without a significant dose of state intervention. Regarding the Marshall Plan, let me insist that public aid was not just a check handed to private companies. It was part of a political and economic programme in which European governments played an essential role, planning, rebuilding, and regulating. It was a brilliant example of cooperation between the public and private sectors under principles of solidarity, long-term vision, and social justice. And if we speak of political distortions, I remind you that markets too are prey to vested interests, monopolies, oligopolies, financial speculation. Economic power without democratic control is just as dangerous as political power without limits. In short, Mr. Smith, I do not ask for blind faith in the state. I ask for reason, evidence, and responsibility. And recent history teaches us that when the state acts intelligently, as in the New Deal, the European reconstruction, or the Nordic countries, it can guide the capitalist system toward a more stable, fairer, and more humane version. I am ready to open the next section.
And that is it for the first round. After listening to both thinkers debate on the role of the state in the economy, we let the AI analyze their arguments, logical structure, and philosophical depth. And the result is clear. In this first round, John Keynes takes the point with a score of 90 points against 80 for Adam Smith. But the debate is far from being over. Let's move on to the second round.
Ladies and gentlemen, there is no clearer moment in which the market's insufficiency is revealed than during deep recessions. In theory, according to the classical view, the market should correct itself. Prices fall, wages adjust, and the economy resumes functioning. But reality has shown time and again that this does not happen automatically. The market can remain stagnant for years. Mass unemployment, far from correcting itself, persists due to a lack of demand. The Great Depression was the clearest proof of this. Millions of people unemployed, factories shut down, investments frozen. And governments, for years, refused to intervene out of fear of distorting the market. It was only when the state began to spend on infrastructure, employment, public works, that the wheels started to turn again. When the private sector stopped spending out of fear or uncertainty, only the state can and must fill that gap. Why? Because the state is not bound by market sentiment. It can invest counter-cyclically. It can sustain demand levels, prevent the collapse of viable businesses, and most importantly, it can protect people. Because behind every unemployment figure lies a broken life. To not intervene during a crisis is not neutrality. It is abandonment. It is to allow the economic cycle to destroy everything in its path, with the vain hope that somehow, magically, it will rebuild itself. Involuntary unemployment is not an adjustment, it is a failure. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, the state must intervene, not as an eternal saviour, but as the guarantor of stability and of the future.
Mr. Keynes, I acknowledge the depth of your concern for human suffering during crises. But allow me to remind you that economics cannot be based solely on emotion, but on solid and lasting principles. Recessions, painful as they may be, are adjustment mechanisms. They are moments when excesses are corrected, when misallocated resources are redirected toward more efficient uses. You propose that the state intervene counter-cyclically, spending when others do not. But by what criteria? With what efficiency? Is it not that very intervention which, by preventing the failure of inefficient firms or inflating demand artificially, prolongs distortions? Bubbles do not arise from the free market itself, but from misguided stimulus, from cheap credit without backing, from policies that push consumption without encouraging savings or real investment. In The Wealth of Nations, I warned against the arrogance of those who believe they can manage the economy like moving chess pieces. The problem is, the pieces are not inert. They are people, with desires, decisions, and risks of their own. When the state becomes an artificial employer or compulsive consumer, it displaces the genuine productive sector. The result may be temporary relief, but also debt, inflation, and structural dependence. You see unemployment as a failure of the market. I see it as a signal that something is not working, that prices, wages, or structures are out of balance. And what is needed is not to cover the problem with spending, but to allow the adjustment to happen, for resources to be reassigned, and for private investment to return. True recovery is that which arises from productivity, not from subsidy.
Interesting reflection, Mr. Smith. Although once again it begins from premises that work better in books than in real life. You describe recession as a mechanism of adjustment, as if human suffering were a necessary, even pedagogical, side effect. But how long must an unemployed family wait for that miraculous adjustment? How many years of depression must pass before capital rediscovers its efficiency? The economy is not a temple of purification. It is the tool with which we organise collective well-being. Allow me to be clear. I am not proposing that the state act as an omnipotent player on a chessboard. I propose that it act as a stabiliser, that it invest when the private sector cannot or does not want to, that it sustains spending levels when consumption and investment collapse, that it prevents, in short, the economy from entering a self-destructive downward spiral, as happened in the 1930s, and again in 2008. You fear artificial demand. I would argue that there is nothing more artificial than market panic. There is no rationality in the collapse of investment due to fear. There is no efficiency in the closure of thousands of viable companies simply because consumers have stopped spending during a temporary contraction. You mentioned debt and inflation. But what about the consequences of not intervening? Loss of human capital, generations marked by precariousness, the disappearance of entire sectors. That is a truly unaffordable economic bill. The state should not displace the private sector, but sustain it when it falls. Is that not precisely the role of automatic stabilisers, unemployment insurance, social spending, that so many developed countries have adopted? The empirical evidence, Mr. Smith, is not on your side. The swift recovery after the COVID-19 crisis in many countries was made possible thanks to fiscal stimulus, not passive adjustment. Private investment is certainly desirable, but if we wait for it to return on its own while the house is burning, all we'll have left in the end is an empty lot.
Mr. Keynes, I recognize your rhetorical mastery, but I cannot accept that the remedy you propose, systematic interventionism, does not end up generating ailments worse than the original disease. You argue that the suffering during crises is intolerable and that the state must intervene to alleviate it. And who could not be moved by the drama of unemployment or poverty? But the key question is, does state intervention solve or merely postpone structural problems? When you propose public spending as a stabilizer, what you are really promoting is an economy sustained by stimulus, not by productivity. And such an economy becomes addicted to spending. Every crisis demands more intervention, more debt, more inflation, more distortion. Is that not what we have seen in Japan for decades? Anemic growth despite constant expansive fiscal policies. Or in some European countries, whose public debt reached unsustainable levels by artificially maintaining inefficient sectors. In contrast, if we allow the market to fulfill its allocation function, yes, even when it hurts, resources flow from obsolete activities to sectors with real potential. That, Mr. Keynes, is what allows for genuine economic rebirth. Not money flowing from a ministry, but innovation, free investment, and the spontaneous discovery of new opportunities. Involuntary unemployment is a tragedy, but subsidizing it indefinitely does not solve it. It turns it into a permanent condition. Instead of manufacturing artificial jobs with public spending, why not reduce hiring restrictions, eliminate bureaucratic barriers, and make entrepreneurship easier? The market, Mr. Keynes, is imperfect, yes, but it is adaptive, dynamic, and 1,000 times more agile than any state agency. What you propose, with good intentions, ultimately slows its capacity for regeneration. And that, in the end, harms even those you seek to protect.
Admirable conviction, Mr. Smith, but your faith in the self-regenerative capacity of the market borders on dogma. Allow me to respond firmly and with data. You claim that interventionism creates dependency and weakens productivity. But what happened during the golden years of capitalism? The glorious 30 front. From 1945 to 1975, it was a period of constant state intervention, public investment, welfare systems, indicative planning, strong unions. And yet it was one of the greatest eras of growth, lowest inequality and lowest unemployment in the history of capitalism. This did not happen thanks to the withdrawal of the state, but because of its active involvement. As for Japan, you mention its debt and stagnation, but you admit that its problem was not excessive spending, but a massive financial bubble, a collapsing demographic, and zombie banks. And even so, its standard of living remains enviable, and its unemployment rate is one of the lowest in the world. Would you really prefer a market cleansing like that of the 1930s, with mass unemployment and financial collapse? You fear that public spending creates artificial employment. I say this, building roads, modernising infrastructure, funding education or healthcare is not artificial, it's investment in the future. Were the highways that energised the US in the 1950s a waste? Is today's public digitalisation not creating tomorrow's productivity? And regarding subsidies, I do not advocate for their perpetuity. I argue they should exist when needed, because the market, in many cases, does not reward the innovative or the brave, but the speculator or the heir. Entrepreneurship does not flourish under extreme deregulation. It flourishes with stability, education, reasonable credit, and protection from total ruin. And that, Mr. Smith, is what the state provides. I repeat, this is not about replacing private initiative, but about creating the conditions in which it can thrive without leaving millions behind. Because an economy that leaves half its people by the wayside may grow, but it will never be truly prosperous.
Mr. Keynes, your data is valid, but your interpretation turns it into a double-edged sword. The glorious 30, as you call them, were certainly years of expansion. But let us not fall into the trap of confusing correlation with causation. That period was also the result of accumulated capital, the momentum of post-war reconstruction, the opening of markets, and, let us not forget, the general respect for property, for international trade, and for the liberal framework I defend. Yes, there was intervention, but there was also a society still disciplined by saving, by work, and by an entrepreneurial class committed to real production. State expansion was not unlimited, nor was it thought to be eternal. When, later on, the state began to multiply in size, to over-intervene, and to burden the economy with bureaucracy and taxes, it led to the stagflation of the 1970s, which forced the world to return to my principles: deregulation, privatization, and openness. Regarding Japan, I do not deny its social virtues, but its model is not universally replicable, and its stagnation is proof that an artificially sustained economy loses dynamism. This is not about letting everything burn, as you say, but about avoiding putting out the fire with gasoline. Easy credit, unchecked spending, eternal subsidies, they feed bubbles and discourage real risk-taking. And regarding roads and hospitals, of course, they are real investments. But not every public work is. Many times, the state spends just for the sake of spending, not to create value. Who decides what is productive? An entrepreneur who risks his capital, or a minister who manages other people's funds? A solid economy is based on incentives. When risk and reward are in the hands of individuals, progress is born. When the state acts as an omnipresent safety net, merit is diluted. And then, as Frederick Bastiat warned, we see what is seen, the ribbon-cutting ceremony. But we forget what is not seen: the capital that was never invested, the job that was never created, the innovation that never emerged. Mr. Keynes, your vision is compassionate. Mine is preventive. You want to heal deep wounds with emergency surgery. I propose strengthening the economic body so it does not fall gravely ill in the first place. And that can only be achieved through the freedom of the market.
After this intense second round, where both titans exchange ideas on recession, crisis, and unemployment, we turn again to the AI that has delivered, according to the logic, depth, and consistency of their arguments, that the winner of this round is Keynes, who once again takes the point with a score of 95 to 70 for Adam Smith. again, look at the other debate on Karl Marx and Adam Smith. Karl Marx won the 2 first rounds. And then Adam Smith took over with the second round and third with the... No. Took over and remontada with the third and fourth round. And he ended up winning the whole debate because he had a higher punctuation. So Adam Smith can still win it in this case. Will he do it? Let's move on to the third round. Let's go.
Ladies and gentlemen, if there is one area where the principles of economic liberalism shine most brightly, it is that of growth. The freedom to produce, trade, invest, and compete not only allows each individual to pursue their own well-being, it generates wealth for the whole of society. In The Wealth of Nations, I made it clear that economic growth is founded on capital accumulation, labor specialization, and free competition. When the state steps aside, laissez-faire, and allows market forces to operate, innovation, efficiency, and expansion flourish. The merchant seeks new markets, the entrepreneur improves their processes, the farmer invests in better tools. No one needs a 5-year plan to know what to produce. They discover it day by day, guided by prices, competition, and the pursuit of profit. Growth is not imposed from above, it rises from below, from thousands of individual decisions. And the most extraordinary thing is that it does not require altruistic motivation. The baker, in pursuit of his own interest, bakes more and better, generating jobs, paying wages, and meeting needs. All of this without being ordered to do so. State intervention, by contrast, stifles this dynamism. High taxes, excessive regulation, and poorly targeted subsidies discourage investment and kill initiative. And worse, they create dependency, not progress. Let me emphasize this. The true source of growth is economic freedom, not public spending. History proves it time and again. Countries that open their economies, protect property, and respect the market prosper. Those that control, restrict, and plan become stagnant. Therefore, if we want lasting growth, we must place our trust not in central planning, but in the creative power of the free market.
Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Smith. Allow me once again to offer a dose of empirical reality in response to your elegant theory. You argue that economic growth emerges solely from individual freedom and unleashed private initiative. And yet, the greatest leaps in sustained growth, productivity, and human progress have had the state as a protagonist, or, at the very least, as an indispensable partner. I do not speak of replacing the market, I insist. I speak of complementing it. Because economic growth is not just about letting private initiative bloom. It's about creating the conditions for that initiative to be viable, secure, and socially useful. Let me be specific. How did the United States achieve its digital revolution? Was it purely through entrepreneurial spirit? Partially, yes. But behind every decisive technological advance, from the internet to microchips, there was public investment in research, defense, and education. As economist Mariana Mazzucato has clearly demonstrated, many of the innovations you celebrate would not exist without an entrepreneurial state willing to take on the risks the market avoided. Similarly, the so-called Asian tigers, often cited as free market success stories, in fact implemented active industrial policies, strategic subsidies, export planning, and temporary protectionism. South Korea did not become a technological powerhouse by simply stepping aside. It did so by investing, coordinating, and guiding its private sector. Growth is not just the production of goods, it is the construction of capabilities, educational, scientific, infrastructural. And in that, the state plays a key role. You claim taxes discourage investment, but what kind of investment thrives in a society without modern infrastructure, without public health to ensure productivity, without a solid educational system? In short, freedom is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient one. The state must be there to sow where the market does not reach, to sustain balance, and to ensure that growth benefits not just the fittest, but society as a whole. Because not everything profitable is desirable, and not everything desirable will be profitable unless the state helps bring it to life.
Mr. Keynes, your argument is refined and your examples are interesting, but your diagnosis, once again, confuses the role of the facilitator with that of the protagonist. That the state may play a supporting role in certain circumstances does not mean it should take center stage in the economy. You mentioned the internet, microchips, and state investment in science and defense. Very well, let's accept it. At times, the state has planted seeds that the private sector has made flourish. But that does not invalidate my thesis, it simply nuances it. Sustained growth, the kind that multiplies from generation to generation, does not come from isolated public projects, but from a system where people are free to invest, compete, and innovate without hindrance. State initiative can, at times, push the boundaries of knowledge, but only the market can turn that knowledge into useful, accessible, and scalable products. You speak of South Korea as an example of state planning, but I think you'll agree that what truly drove its takeoff was not autarky, but trade openness, global competition, and the productive efforts of millions of workers and entrepreneurs within a framework of legal certainty. The danger in your reasoning is believing that because the state can sometimes intervene successfully, it should do so systematically. And that is where the problem lies. Because the state does not respond to efficiency incentives, it does not risk its own capital, and it does not go bankrupt when it fails. It can waste resources for years without direct consequences, while discouraging private action, which does depend on merit. When I say that high taxes and excessive regulations slow growth, I do not speak in the abstract. I speak of small and medium-sized businesses that never start, of entrepreneurs who give up, of savings that never become investment because the system punishes them. Growth does not need a guiding hand. It needs space to expand. If the state becomes the gardener that plants and waters everything, it will soon drown the roots of entrepreneurship. Let it instead be fertile ground, safe, stable, and free. There, Mr. Keynes, prosperity will flourish.
A coherent defense, Mr. Smith, but still excessively idealistic and disconnected from the concrete experience of the 20th and 21st centuries. You insist that growth flourishes when the market is left to act freely, and that the state, at best, should merely be fertile ground. But I ask you, what land can be fertile without prior investment in irrigation, roads, fertilizer, and protection from storms? History shows us that the countries that have grown the most are not those with minimal states, but those with intelligent, strategic, and active ones. The problem is not intervention itself, but the quality of that intervention. And that is where we must focus the debate. Because your vision, though well-intentioned, rests on the assumption that the market, if given freedom, naturally produces an optimal allocation of resources. But real innovation, the kind that changes paradigms, is not always profitable in the short term. And there, Mr. Smith, the market stops. Let us return to Apple, Google, Tesla, companies glorified as examples of entrepreneurial genius. And yet, in their early stages, they drew directly from publicly funded technologies. GPS, touchscreens, advanced batteries, even voice assistants. All of them originated in labs sustained by public funds. You say the state does not risk its capital, but does it not, in fact, risk the money of all to build common knowledge? Is that not a collective act of faith far more valuable than any individual bet? Moreover, the legal certainty you call for is not a spontaneous product. It stems from strong institutions, many born from public action. Without trust in the legal system, without a stable currency, without shared infrastructure, the market does not expand. It stalls. Do we want growth? Perfect. Then let us build a state that invests in higher education, in basic science, in sustainable transportation, in future energy, because the market will never fund what has uncertain or long-term returns. That, not blind deregulation, is where the future of prosperity lies. Therefore, Mr. Smith, the state must be neither omnipresent nor absent. It must take the lead when no one else can, and step aside when citizens are ready to carry on. That is true economic wisdom.
Mr. Keynes, I acknowledge your mastery in dressing up interventionism with the language of moderation and good sense. But let the audience not be mistaken. What you are ultimately proposing is a progressive shift of economic protagonism from the free individual to the planning state. You ask me what land can be fertile without public investment in irrigation, fertilizer, or protection. I respond, Fertile land is not created by drowning it in planning. It is created by ensuring freedom, stability, and respect for property rights. Where individuals know their fruits will not be expropriated and their decisions will not be hindered, there they invest, create, and take risks. It is true that some innovations arose in public environments, but it is no less true that it was the private sector that turned them into useful and transformative goods. You cite Apple, Tesla, Google. I ask you, why did no equivalent companies arise in the USSR whose state apparatus devoted enormous resources to research? Because lasting growth does not arise from public money alone, but from the convergence of creativity, personal risk, and clear incentives. Furthermore, what you call public investment is often, in practice, political allocation of resources, subject to favoritism, ideological fads, or electoral short-sightedness. While the market self-corrects through competition, the state rarely pays for its mistakes. And you are right about one thing: legal certainty, a stable currency, clear rules. These are not spontaneous. But neither do they require an omnipresent state. They require a just, limited, and predictable state, one that creates the framework but does not invade the board. Growth does not need the state to take the lead when no one else can. What it needs is for the state not to interfere when citizens are already able to act. Because every intervention, no matter how well-intentioned, displaces a free decision. And without economic freedom, without real freedom, there is no progress, only dependence. I conclude this block by reaffirming what both experience and common sense teach us. When people are free to trade, compete, and innovate, when they are not dependent on a bureaucrat's favor, then and only then does solid, sustainable, and truly human growth emerge.
A passionate conclusion, Mr. Smith, but once again I must emphasize a key point. The freedom you defend, without minimum conditions of equity and opportunity, is not freedom for all, but privilege for a few. You speak of fertile ground created solely by the guarantee of property and stability. But what happens when vast sectors of the population lack access to capital, to education, to healthcare, or to even the basic environment that would allow them to compete? The ideal of freedom you champion paradoxically requires a prior structure, one that only public action can provide. I do not propose to drown freedom, but to expand it. Not with authoritarian control, but with strategic investment. Not with centralized planning, but with collective vision and democratic responsibility. It is true that the state does not always get it right, just as the market does not. But at least the state can and must be corrected through political and civic processes. Who corrects the monopoly that arises from supposed free competition? Who rescues the innovator who fails when there is no safety net? Truly human economic growth is not merely that which produces numbers, but that which builds sustainable well-being, distributes opportunities, and prepares for the future. And for that, Mr. Smith, the state is not the enemy of the market. It is its guarantor. A referee, yes, but also an investor when no one else dares, a protector when everything trembles, and a promoter of the future when the present is not enough.
Round 3 is over. This time, the debate focused on economic growth. Both perspectives made an impact, but one of them managed to stand out according to the AI logical, structural, and argumentative analysis. And the point for this round goes to Keynes, with a score of 88 against 82 for Adam Smith. But now let's go to the fourth and final topic. That is justice and social. No, that is inequality and social justice.
Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to be blunt. An economy that generates growth without distributing its fruits justly is sowing the seeds of its own instability. Inequality is not only a moral issue, though it certainly is, it is also an economic burden. When a portion of the population concentrates wealth while millions live in uncertainty or misery, aggregate demand weakens, social mobility stalls, and the cohesion of the entire system erodes. You, Mr. Smith, defend the idea that the pursuit of self-interest generates spontaneous order. But I ask you, how can one act freely when born without access to decent education, without healthcare security, without basic safety nets? That initial inequality is not corrected by the market. In fact, the market tends to reproduce it and even deepen it. That is why the state must intervene, not to impose total equality, but to ensure that the starting conditions are fair. Progressive taxes, quality public services, redistributive policies, these are not threats to freedom. They are the very conditions that make freedom possible. Because without minimum equity, freedom becomes a luxury reserved for those who already have everything. Moreover, extreme inequality corrupts institutions, captures the state, distorts markets, and breeds resentment. How can we speak of merit when the starting line is so uneven that the poor man's effort is worth half that of the rich? Modern economies cannot afford to ignore social justice, because without it, political instability, populism, and mistrust eventually destroy even economic achievements. For all these reasons, I hold that the state has an undeniable duty to correct social imbalances, not out of charity, but out of economic intelligence and historical responsibility.
Mr. Keynes, I understand your concern about inequality, and I share the premise that a civilized society must not ignore the suffering of others. But allow me to state clearly, inequality is not the enemy of progress. Poverty is. And the best tool humanity has known for reducing poverty has not been redistribution, but market-driven growth. In The Wealth of Nations, I observed that when a society grows through free labor and trade, even the humblest worker benefits. I wrote, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable." Economic freedom, far from enriching only a few, raises the living standards of all. History confirms this. Liberal capitalism has lifted more people out of poverty than any redistribution program ever has. You insist that without public intervention, there is no equality of opportunity. I reply, poorly directed state intervention creates new privileges, permanent dependencies, and a bureaucratic class that lives off others' labor. Who ensures that progressive taxes won't end up financing inefficient structures, political patronage, or subsidies that perpetuate stagnation? Moreover, the obsessive drive to reduce all inequality may end up cutting off the rewards for merit, risk-taking, and innovation. And when we disincentivize success, we ultimately impoverish society as a whole. Is it not fairer to have a system where each person rises by their own talent and effort, rather than being held back by an artificial ceiling so as not to stray too far from the average? I do not propose abandoning the weak. I propose empowering the individual, educating, not controlling, creating conditions so that everyone can rise on their own without depending on state handouts. Because dignity, Mr. Keynes, is not built on subsidies, but on autonomy. The equality I defend is not one of outcomes, but one of liberty. That everyone has the right and the responsibility to forge their own destiny in a free, fair, and open market.
An eloquent response, Mr. Smith. But allow me to highlight what I consider your greatest fallacy: confusing freedom with individual self-sufficiency and inequality with a mere reflection of merit. You claim that the market has lifted millions out of poverty. True. But it has done so, and this is crucial, in contexts where state intervention was part of the process. Public education, infrastructure, healthcare, social protection. No country has developed a strong middle class without the state. None. Your defense of bare freedom, without a safety net, without context, is admirable in its theoretical purity, but deeply dangerous in its practical application. Do you really believe that a child born in a poor neighborhood, without access to proper nutrition, without a decent education system, competes on equal footing with the child of a wealthy family, with inheritance, private tutors, and social capital? And that the market will correct this on its own? And let's talk about subsidies. You fear they generate dependency. I share the concern, but I refuse to accept that the solution is to leave the most vulnerable without protection. We are not talking about perpetuating aid, but about using it as a lever for autonomy, not as an anchor. As for progressive taxes, if a democratic society decides to redistribute part of its wealth to guarantee a dignified life for all, that is not clientelism. That is civilization. That is the social contract. It is not about punishing success. It is about preventing success from becoming an impenetrable wall for everyone else. Merit only makes sense if it starts from a reasonably level playing field. extreme inequality is not only unjust, it is inefficient. Because it sidelines talent, undermines mobility, and erodes trust in the rules of the game. Ultimately, Mr. Smith, I too believe in freedom. But real freedom requires social justice to avoid becoming an aristocratic fiction. And that justice, in the modern world, is not guaranteed by the market. It is guaranteed by an active, responsible state committed to the common good.
Mr. Keynes, you present a dilemma that seems unassailable. Either we accept an active, redistributive state, or we condemn entire generations to abandonment. But allow me to reject that dichotomy as false. I do not propose bare freedom, but freedom accompanied by strong institutions, access to justice, and clear rules. And that is indeed the role of the state. Now, what we cannot accept, neither morally nor economically, is treating inequality as an evil in itself. What matters is not how much distance exists between the richest and the poorest, but whether the poor are better off today than they were yesterday. And in the freest economies, those that prioritize entrepreneurship over subsidies, living standards have improved more quickly and with greater dignity. You mention a poor child without access to education. And I ask you, do you truly believe that only the state can guarantee education? Would it not be more effective to have a system where families have real options, not tied to state monopolies? Competition not only improves markets, it can also improve public services. The problem with your vision, Mr. Keynes, is that it assumes public power is neutral, wise, and well-intentioned. But reality shows us that when the state accumulates functions, it tends to concentrate power, distribute privileges based on political interests, and build structures that perpetuate its own expansion. A subsidy, when it becomes a perpetual right, is not a lever, it is an invisible chain. And about progressive taxes, of course, they can be legitimate. But when they reach excessive levels, they punish those who take risks, discourage investment, and provoke the flight of capital, talent, and effort. You call that civilization. But I warn you, a society that punishes merit and rewards dependency risks eroding its productive foundation. True social justice is not achieved by leveling from above, but by lifting from below. And that is what the market does, offering jobs, opportunities, and mobility. Give individuals freedom and responsibility, and the result will be more powerful and more just than any redistributive decree.
A passionate conclusion, Mr. Smith. But allow me to close this block with a statement I consider fundamental. Social justice is not the enemy of freedom. It is its deepest guarantee. You fear that state intervention erodes merit, disincentivizes productivity, and rewards passivity. But what you fail to recognize is that in a deeply unequal society, merit loses meaning. Because talent exists everywhere, but opportunity does not. And when opportunities are not distributed, we are not speaking of freedom. We are speaking of an illusion dressed in meritocratic rhetoric. I do not propose punishing those who take risks. I propose making it possible for more people to take risks, so that the child born today, in the periphery, also has access to healthcare, education, financial literacy, and yes, a cushion that allows them to try without being condemned for life if they fail. That is not paternalism, Mr. Smith. It is empowerment. You insist that the market lifts from below. Sometimes it does, but other times it widens gaps, monopolizes sectors, and excludes the less competitive without offering them a path forward. And when that happens, the state is not a nuisance. It is the only force capable of ensuring that progress is shared, not exclusive. As for the risk of state power being abused, of course it exists. That is why I advocate for a democratic, transparent, and accountable state, not an omnipotent one. But the fact that a tool can be misused is not an argument for abolishing it. It is a call to improve it. True progress, Mr. Smith, is not measured only by how many succeed, but by how many are left behind. Because an economy that leaves millions behind is not sustainable, neither morally nor economically. So yes, let us defend freedom, but a freedom with material conditions for everyone. Because dignity is not merely proclaimed, it must be guaranteed. And in the 21st century, that guarantee requires more than competition and individual will. It requires a state unafraid to intervene when justice demands it. I'm ready to close the debate whenever you are.
Mr. Keynes, you have presented your vision with nobility and conviction. But allow me, in this final intervention, to return to the core of what separates us. You believe the state is the ultimate guarantor of justice. I hold that its intervention should be the exception, not the rule. Not out of disregard for justice, but out of respect for freedom. That freedom which you call illusory, if not equal, and which I defend as the foundation of all real prosperity. The social justice you propose inevitably rests on the forced transfer of resources from those who produce to those who do not. And when that becomes institutionalized, it not only disincentivizes excellence, but also fosters a culture of rights without duties, of expectations without effort. How can we build a vigorous society if we erode the link between merit and reward? You say the market sometimes excludes. I reply, the market excludes inefficiencies, not people. In fact, it is the only system that, by its very logic, must constantly integrate new talent, creative solutions, and a workforce eager to improve itself. It is meritocratic, yes, but also inclusive if allowed to function. Of course, we must help those who have fallen. But that help must be temporary, empowering, and never become a way of life. When the state takes on the mission of equalizing conditions through constant redistribution, what it achieves is to freeze differences, institutionalize dependency, and slow the very mobility it claims to promote. Do we want a society where everyone has opportunities? Then let us reduce barriers, free up trade, simplify taxation, and allow each person with their unique talents to find their place in the system. True equity is not achieved by dividing what already exists, but by creating more for everyone. And so I close, Mr. Keynes, with the firm conviction that economic freedom, regulated with justice but never replaced, is the best guarantee of dignity, mobility, and yes, real and sustainable social justice. Let the state safeguard the rules, but let the game be played by the citizens. Because only then, with strong institutions and free markets, does the wealth of nations truly flourish.
And the final round is over. Two opposing visions of the same world have reached their final act. Keynes and Smith have passionately defended their views on inequality and social fairness. The AI has listened to every word, proceeded every argument, and made its decision. The winner of this final round is, again, John Keynes, with a score of 90 against 75 for Adam Smith. 4 rounds, 4 topics, and after analyzing each debate, the AI has delivered its final verdict. John Keynes ate Adam Smith with an average score of 91 to 77. But maybe the real question isn't who won the debate, but what have we learned from listening to them? Both made great points and great statements, so we can take great parts from both. Keynes and Smith don't represent just economic systems, they represent ways of understanding humanity, justice, freedom, and progress. And you, after listening to this duel, whose side are you on? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching the video, especially until the end. Subscribe if you enjoyed it and if you want more economic debates like this one. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video. Ciao!